From this precipice, to the rapturous astonishment of thousands of spectators, these bold adventurers floated safe in the atmosphere, buoyed up by a power lighter than air itself. The sight was truly sublime. The spectators were all eyes, and their hearts all feeling. The serenity and composure visible on the countenances of these two extraordinary characters, the display of two beautiful flags, the red ensign of England and the royal standard of France, the elegance of the little wherry that sustained the passengers, the expansion of the silken oars, and the stupendous magnificence of the balloon itself, with the sunbeams full upon them, was a sight which leaves all description at a distance and requires indeed 1,000 witnesses to establish the truth of this most wonderful spectacle. So did the correspondent of the Gentleman's Magazine describe, perhaps a little breathlessly, the ascent of Frenchman Jean-Francois Blanchard and the American Dr. John Jeffreys in their hydrogen balloon from Dover Castle on the 7th of January 1785 in what was to become the first crossing of the English Channel by air. Jeffreys and Blanchard were two interesting characters. Jeffreys, despite being born in Boston, the crucible of American republicanism, was loyal to the king during the Revolution and, being a trained doctor, was a surgeon for British soldiers in Charleston and Savannah. Moving to England after the war, he became interested in ballooning and agreed to finance the construction of Blanchard's balloon for the cross-channel flight. Blanchard himself was an experienced and rather restless balloonist, making the first balloon flights in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Bohemia, Switzerland, and eventually the United States. He was described as a petulant little fellow, not many inches over 5 feet, and physically well suited for vapourish regions. Petulant seems to have been the right word, because it became clear that even though Jeffreys had paid for the balloon, Blanchard had no intention of taking him along for the flight and thus having to share the glory. Jeffreys was only able to board by recruiting a mob of sailors and basically marching on Dover Castle. Blanchard finally relented, but only on the condition that Jeffreys agreed to jump out if it looked like the balloon might for some reason sink into the sea. You can imagine then that there was a somewhat frosty atmosphere between the two aeronauts as their balloon soared over Dover Castle and began to drift with the wind across the channel to France. Quite quickly, though, things began to go wrong. Hydrogen contracts in colder temperatures, which reduces the lift, and as the aeronauts flew further out over the bitterly cold English Channel, the balloon began to sink. Remembering his agreement with Blanchard, Dr. Jeffreys must have felt rather nervous as he watched the uninviting grey sea drawing closer and closer and closer. They had brought along 30 pounds of ballast, which they rapidly discarded, but the balloon still sunk lower and lower in the sky. Blanchard had designed the balloon with 2 great silk oars with which he hoped to row through the air. Now, needless to say, these were absolutely useless and were among the first items to be thrown overboard in their increasingly frantic attempts to reduce weight and gain altitude. The intrepid adventurers ripped off and chucked away the pretty ornaments on the side of the gas bag and all of the balloon's ropes and anchors. They threw their coats overboard, as well as their lunch, and then their trousers, and Blanchard realised that they could provide a few more precious ounces of lift by peeing over the side of the gondola. Eventually, they found a warm breeze, the hydrogen expanded, and they finally began to rise. They crossed the French coast near Calais at around 3 in the afternoon, and thus became the first men to cross the English Channel by air, a record even more significant when you realise it was achieved only 14 months after the world's very first manned flight in a hot air balloon constructed by the Montgolfier brothers. It is not known what the residents of Calais thought of the bizarre spectacle of 2 frazzled, half-naked and, given that they'd thrown their lunch in the sea, presumably ravenously hungry aeronauts stepping out of the gondola of their much-denuded balloon. But Blanchard records that they were treated very kindly by the locals, who even lent them their clothes. Having achieved such a momentous feat together, and gone through what must have been quite a hair-raising experience in each other's company, I like to think that Jean-Francois Blanchard and Dr. John Jeffreys shook hands, let bygones be bygones, and parted as friends. But perhaps I'm being over-optimistic. Welcome to episode 2 of Upship, the Airship History Podcast. I'm Nick Rogers, your captain on this long-haul flight through the history of airships. Last episode, I outlined why airship history is important. On this episode, we will trace the origins and early development of lighter-than-air technology. We'll look at the first balloons, from the hot air balloons pioneered by the Montgolfier brothers to hydrogen balloons like that flown across the channel by our friends Blanchard and Jeffries. It was great fun to interview Becky Wigland, curator of the National Balloon Museum in Indianola, Iowa, for this episode. The full interview with Becky will be shared on a future Patreon episode, but I'll be sharing her views on the history as we go. And on our next Patreon episode, I'll be talking to Lynn Newton, who is the curator of the Anderson Abruzzo International Balloon Museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My sources for this episode were Lighter Than Air by Lee Payne, Military, Civil and Naval Airships Since 1783 by Daniel George Ridley Kitts, MBE, Early Balloons and Airships by Charles Rivers Editors, and the website of the British Balloon Museum and Library. What is it about flying? So many of us seem drawn to the sky, compelled to fly by some deep urge inside us which we seem powerless to resist. Often it seems to start in childhood with a passion for the idea of being up in the sky in an aircraft. Maybe it's the attraction of having a different perspective on the world. Amelia Earhart said, "You haven't seen a tree until you've seen its shadow from the sky." Maybe it's about freedom, the ability to soar like a bird and go wherever you please, slipping the surly bonds of earth. Wherever it comes from, the dream of flight is nothing new. Blanchard and Jeffries made their pioneering flight in January 1785. 14 months earlier, the first recorded human free flight had taken place in a balloon constructed by the Montgolfier brothers. But even those great aeronauts were building on ideas about flight that had existed for over 2,000 years. In our last episode, we briefly joined Hugo Eckener in an unsettling meeting with the sculptor Ambrosi, whose sculpture of Icarus unnerved him so the day before the Hindenburg disaster. The Greek myth of Icarus is one of the very first depictions of flight, a story of a father and son who constructed 2 pairs of wings to escape imprisonment in ancient Crete. Daedalus, an engineer, was successful in his flight, but his son Icarus, giddy with the sense of flying freedom that I talked about earlier, flies too close to the sun. The wax holding his wings together melts, and he plunges to his death in the Ionian Sea. Greek mythology also gives us Pegasus, a winged horse captured by the hero Bellerophon, who rides him in numerous adventures through ancient Greece. Pegasus also was the emblem of British airborne troops in the Second World War. The night before the 6th of June D-Day landings in Normandy, soldiers of the British 6th Airborne Division captured and held a vital bridge outside Ouistreham, forever known as Pegasus Bridge, and in fact one of my favourite D-Day locations. But I digress. There are a number of recorded attempts at flight by men adopting similar methods to Daedalus and Icarus into the medieval period. Often monks, these brave or idiotic men, would construct pairs of wings, climb up a tower or church belfry, and jump off, presumably flapping furiously. None seemed to be particularly successful, and most of these flights ended rather unpleasantly for the would-be aeronaut. Kites were invented in China in the 6th century, and there are numerous records from the 7th century onward in China and Japan of kites being used to carry men into the air. In China, this was originally used as a form of punishment and seems actually to have been a rather terrifying means of execution, as the vast majority of criminals punished in this way were killed, probably either falling or crashing to their deaths. But man-lifting kites were also used for less deadly purposes. The explorer Marco Polo describes a man being sent aloft in a kite to determine whether or not the winds were suitable for a ship to set sail, and there are records of man-lifting kites being used for reconnaissance and communication. I suppose that these man-lifting kites are the direct descendants of modern-day hang gliding, and I must admit I love flying in all sorts of different aircraft, but you'd need to pay me an awful lot of money before I'd agree to get strapped onto a man-lifting kite and lifted into the air, entirely powerless to control myself. The ancient Chinese also identified the fact that hot air rises because there are records of sky lanterns being used as early as the 3rd century BC. A Chinese general, surrounded once by enemy troops, summoned help by means of a message written on a sky lantern, which prefigures the use of balloons in warfare, which we'll be looking at in the next episode. Famously, Leonardo da Vinci held an abiding interest in aviation and designed a number of different aircraft types, including parachutes, gliders, rotorcraft, and an ornithopter. Although he made a number of models of some of these craft, he is not believed to ever have attempted to fly in any, which for him was probably just as well. A couple of hundred years after Da Vinci, in 1670, we get the first real attempt at designing a serious lighter-than-air aircraft. Father Francesco Lana de Terzi, a Jesuit at the University of Ferrara, designed a flying boat that would be raised aloft by the means of 4 copper foil balls with the air pumped out of them, creating a vacuum that would be lighter than the surrounding air and would therefore rise. The balls were 24 feet in diameter and would support a wooden hull for passengers and even a sail for propulsion. Father de Terzi envisioned that lighter-than-air aircraft could be used as weapons of war, and for that reason he doubted that such aircraft would ever be constructed, saying, "God will never allow such a machine be built, because everybody realizes that no city would be safe from raids, iron weights, fireballs, and bombs could be hurled from great height." In reality, the reason his aircraft never came to fruition was because atmospheric pressure would have crushed the copper balls. But he is the inventor of what's called the vacuum airship, a concept that has never been realized but refuses to go away. In 1709, a Brazilian theologist named Bartholomew de Gusmão went public with his design for an airship named the Passarola. Propelled through the somewhat ill-defined use of magnets, the airship was to be held in the air by a huge sail, kept inflated by gigantic pumps when there was no wind. And you can see a model of the Passarola in Chile's National Air and Space Museum in Santiago. Although this fanciful craft was never built, de Gusmão presented a hot air balloon to King John V of Portugal on the 8th of August 1709. It was his 4th attempt at doing so, having nearly set the palace on fire a few days previously. The small paper balloon rose from the ground and floated around the room in front of a highly entertained King John, who rewarded de Gusmão by appointing him to a professorship and making him a canon. De Gusmão eventually fell foul of the Portuguese Inquisition and died in Toledo in 1724, aged 38. His contribution to the history of lighter-than-air flight was not quite over, though. In 1936, the Zeppelin Company built an airport in Rio de Janeiro for the use of its long-range airships Graf Zeppelin and Hindenburg. The Zeppelin Company named it the Bartholomew de Gusmão Airport. Now we come to the first genuine household names in this podcast, the Montgolfier brothers. Titanic figures in the history of aviation. We will look at their achievements after the break. Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier came from a long line of highly successful and wealthy paper manufacturers. The family company was founded back in 1557 by Jacques Montgolfier, and quite amazingly is still in business today as Consul et Montgolfier. The company logo is, of course, a stylized hot air balloon. Joseph was the 12th and Etienne the 15th of 16 children, all of whom worked in the family business. They were 2 quite different characters, Joseph the shy, absent-minded dreamer, Etienne the hard-nosed mathematical businessman, but both developed a strong interest in the possibilities of flight, and, having plenty of free time and lots of money, they dedicated themselves to the problem of how to get into the air. They experimented with various types of material, initially paper bags, which they tried to fill with steam from a kettle, and also hydrogen, but the gases passed right through the paper and the bags went nowhere. One chilly winter's afternoon, Joseph was at a friend's house in Avignon, staring into the fire and apparently musing on ways in which the great British fortress of Gibraltar could be captured. He concluded it would have to be done from the air, whilst watching embers rising up from the grate in currents of hot air. Thinking that buoyancy actually came from the smoke, he took a piece of paper, folded it to enclose the smoke, and watched it rise up the chimney. He then quickly fashioned a silk bag and repeated the experiment, observing with delight as the bag rose to the ceiling and remained there for a full minute. He dashed off a letter to Etienne, and I'm not going to do my appalling French accent, saying, "Prepare a supply of taffeta and cordage, and you shall see the most astonishing thing in the world." Over a number of months, the brothers experimented and refined their technique in preparation for their first public demonstration. Interestingly, they believed they had discovered a new gas, which Joseph modestly called Montgolfier gas, produced by the smoke and which lifted their balloons. So they burned wool, wet straw, and even old meat to produce as much smoke as possible. On the 4th of June 1783, a large crowd of dignitaries, including members of the Regional Assembly, gathered in the public square of the French town of Annonay, a little south of Lyon and home to the Montgolfier family, to watch the first public demonstration of the Montgolfier brothers' work. Etienne described the balloon. The aerostatic machine was constructed of cloth lined with paper, fastened together on a network of strings fixed to the cloth. It was spherical, its circumference was 110 feet, and a wooden frame 16 feet square held it fixed at the bottom. 2 men sufficed to raise it and fill it with gas, but it took 8 to hold it down till the signal was given. Joseph gave the signal, the 8 men let go, and the balloon rose to 6,000 feet, drifted for over 1.5 miles, and landed 10 minutes later. The remaining embers in the brazier set the balloon alight. To this day, the citizens of Annonay stage an annual reenactment of the inflation and the flight, complete with characters in period attire. Following an unfortunate incident a few months later, when a hydrogen-filled balloon, launched by the physicist Jacques Charles, was torn to pieces by a pitchfork-wielding mob of peasants who thought it was the work of the devil, the French government issued a proclamation notifying the public of the discovery, crediting the Montgolfier brothers with the first flight, and advising people that the balloons, which they described rather poetically as looking like the darkened moon during an eclipse, presented no harm, and that they will someday prove serviceable to the wants of society. 2 weeks after that proclamation, and after a further test flight, the Montgolfier brothers were in Paris on the orders of King Louis XVI, who commanded them to arrange a flight in the grounds of Versailles. This time, it was to feature living creatures, a duck, a rooster, and a sheep called Mont au Ciel, which means climb to the sky. The 3 hapless aeronauts were placed in a wicker basket that swung under the balloon as it rose to 1,500 feet and drifted for 15 minutes before floating back to the earth. The occupants were unscathed by the flight, although the poor rooster's leg was broken when he was kicked by the sheep. Mont au Ciel, the sheep, was added to the royal menagerie at Versailles. Sadly, we do not know what happened to the duck and the rooster, but they definitely earned themselves a place in the Aviation Hall of Fame, and hopefully not places in the royal ovens.
When we sent our people up to the atmosphere, we didn't send humans first. We sent like dogs and monkeys and those. Well, they were just as brilliant. They sent a sheep, a chicken, and a duck or a goose, and in a basket. And of course, the heat is on the ground, and so as soon as it goes up and then it cools off, it comes down.
Yeah.
So it was only like a 15-minute flight, but I was kind of amazed of the 3 that they chose. They didn't have any. The animals all came back, but they decided on the goat or the sheep because they never fly. And the chickens kind of fly, and the geese can fly, and none of them were damaged, so they figured that it would work.
All of this was just a prelude, though, the overture before the main show. What was the purpose of building these aircraft if not to transport humans? Da Vinci, de Guzman, the Montgolfier brothers. None of these guys were in this game just to work out how to help sheep fly. Accordingly, the brothers built a balloon large enough to carry humans. 75 feet tall, 48 feet in diameter, and capable of holding 80,000 cubic feet of hot air. It was richly decorated with the king's monogram, golden fleur-de-lis, and the signs of the zodiac on a blue background. The aeronauts were accommodated in a small wicker basket that ran around the base of the balloon, and they had to balance on either side of the craft. At first, they made tethered flights, and in early October 1783, likely the 15th, Etienne Montgolfier became the first human to leave the Earth in a hot air balloon, tethered to a rope 80 feet long. Later that day, the physicist Pilatre de Rosier became the second human to do so. Over the next few days, the tether became longer and longer, until it reached a length of over 300 feet, and multiple different aeronauts had taken turns flying. King Louis himself was very heavily involved in the discussions about this new and exciting technology. Clearly, the honour of France was at stake, and he did not want any negative publicity should something go wrong. Rather than risk the life of an aristocrat, the king wanted the first free flight to be made by two criminals. But Pilatre de Rosier was not having any of it, and said, should vile criminals, foul murderers, men rejected from the bosom of society have the glory of being the first to navigate the field of air? Never, while Pilatre de Rosier draws breath. Maybe Pilatre was being a little bombastic, but you can see his point. And also, if the king had had his way, and they'd sent up two criminals, I don't think they would have hung around meekly waiting to go back to prison upon landing. They'd have legged it. 21st of November, 1783. The latest milestone in what had been an intensely busy and successful year for the Montgolfier brothers. 500,000 spectators gathered in the presence of King Louis in the grounds of the Château de la Muette on the western outskirts of Paris to watch the first free flight ever undertaken by humankind. The beautifully decorated balloon, held to the ground by men grappling with straining ropes, its lift provided by the fire burning in an iron basket slung under the hull, rose gently into the air at a signal given by Pilatre de Rosier at 1:54 p.m. De Rosier was accompanied by the Marquis d'Arlandes, a military officer who had helped persuade the king not to give the honour of the first flight to criminals, and who had then found himself volunteered for the job. D'Arlandes gives a wonderful description of the flight in a letter to a friend. I was surprised at the silence and absence of movement which our departure caused among the spectators, and believed them to be astonished and perhaps awed at the strange spectacle. They might well have reassured themselves. I was still gazing when Monsieur Rosier cried to me, "You are doing nothing, and the balloon is scarcely rising a fathom." "Pardon me," I answered, as I placed a bundle of straw upon the fire and slightly stirred it. Then I turned quickly, but we had already passed out of sight of La Muette. Astonished, I cast a glance towards the river. I perceived the confluence of the Oise, and naming the principal bends of the river by the places nearest to them, I cried, "Passy, Saint-Germain, Saint-Denis, Sèvres." "If you look at the river in that fashion, you will likely bathe in it soon," cried Rosier. "Some fire, my dear friend, some fire." D'Arlandes freely admits that he was quite scared at certain points during the flight and appealed to de Rosier to land more than once. Clearly a generous man, he also credits de Rosier with being cool and collected and never losing his head. They floated over the rooftops of Paris for 25 minutes, covering a distance of 5 miles, coming to rest in open countryside in an area called Butte-aux-Cailles, now a dense suburb of Paris. The landing is commemorated by a monument raised at the actual location of their landfall, the junction of the Rue Bobbio and the Rue Vendrezan, and by a nearby park named after the Montgolfier brothers. Famously, one of the 500,000 people who observed the flight was the American ambassador to France, Benjamin Franklin. Afterwards, Franklin mused on the possibilities presented by balloon flight. Like so many before and since, Franklin believed the balloon could be such a potent weapon that it would bring about an end to war, if only. The successful flight of the Montgolfier brothers' balloon signalled an explosion of balloon activity across France and eventually much of Europe and the United States. 10 days after the first manned free flight, Professor Jacques Charles conducted the first manned free flight in a hydrogen balloon. Although his balloon was smaller than the Montgolfier brothers and lacked the rich decoration, hydrogen has a greater lifting capacity than hot air, so he stayed aloft for a full 2 hours, taken off from the Tuileries Garden in central Paris with his co-aeronaut Monsieur Robert, and landing 27 miles away. In a touching gesture of comradeship, Joseph Montgolfier was present at the launch and gave Charles a small balloon to release in order to test the wind direction. Charles described that wonderful sensation of flying freedom, capturing it for the first time in the history of aviation. Nothing will ever equal that moment of joyous excitement which filled my whole being when I felt myself flying away from the earth. It was not mere pleasure, it was perfect bliss. Having escaped from the frightful torments of persecution and of calumny, I felt I was answering all in rising above all. On whatever side we looked, all was glorious, a cloudless sky above, a most delicious view around. "Oh, my friend," I said to Monsieur Robert, "how great is our good fortune! I care not what may be the condition of the earth. It is the sky that is for me now." Perhaps he spoke too soon, because, on landing, Monsieur Robert stepped out of the gondola and the now lightened balloon shot up to a height of 2 miles with poor Professor Charles still in it, in an unwitting demonstration of the load exchange problem that still has modern airship designers scratching their heads. After he eventually landed, the professor never flew again. And funnily enough, Joseph Montgolfier also only had one flight before deciding that perhaps it wasn't for him. All this was so new, and there were no frames of reference. How could you possibly know whether you would enjoy the sensation of flight without actually trying it? There were, however, many others who did catch the bug. The first British balloon flight was in September 1784, conducted by the Italian Vincenzo Lunardi, who flew a hydrogen balloon from Finsbury in North London to Standon End Green in Hertfordshire. Lunardi had spent much effort drumming up publicity for the flight, and a crowd of 150,000 people, including the 14-year-old Prince of Wales, gathered to watch his takeoff. Lunardi was accompanied by some furry friends, his pet dog and cat, and also 2 caged pigeons. The cat apparently didn't take kindly to flying because Lunardi describes him as being so benumbed as to be rendered motionless. Lunardi himself took some time to get used to the height, at first becoming giddy whenever he tried to look over the side of the basket, but eventually finding his air legs. Seeing someone he knew in the spectators on the ground during his flight, Lunardi lowered the balloon and threw his cat down to his friend to prevent any further suffering. There's an engraving of Lunardi sitting with his cat and his dog. The poor cat looks like he's still traumatized from the experience. Lunardi went on to make a number of ascents in Great Britain, once surviving an emergency landing in the freezing cold North Sea. He was so taken by the welcome he received in this country that he repainted his balloon with a gigantic British flag, a gesture of which I thoroughly approve. Sadly, the history of early balloons was also marked by tragedy as well as adventure. Aviation history is littered with crashes, disasters, and deaths, and it did not take long for the first recorded aviation fatalities to occur. In a cruel irony, the first air crash claimed the life of our old friend Piletro de Rosier, who therefore has the dubious honour of being one of the first 2 humans to free fly, as well as being one of the first 2 humans to die in an air crash. He and his companion, Pierre Romain, were in fact attempting to cross the English Channel 6 months after Blanchard and Jeffreys. They were to do so in a new type of hybrid balloon that used both hot air and hydrogen to generate lift, funded by a hefty grant from the French government. The flight started badly. Launching from Boulogne-sur-Mer on the Channel, they were beaten back by the wind until they were 5 kilometres beyond where they had started. Then the inevitable happened. The hydrogen caught fire, the balloon deflated, and together with its 2 occupants it crashed to the ground near a town called Wimereux in the Pas-de-Calais, killing both men. De Rosier's fiancée witnessed the crash and died 8 days later, supposedly of a broken heart. A sad end for a great aviation pioneer. Despite this tragedy, balloon fever gripped Europe and America. The public turned out in large crowds to witness ever more spectacular stunts that included fireworks, parachutes, and other gimmicks. Ballooning influenced fashion, hairstyles, children's toys, and even furniture design. Some, like Benjamin Franklin, however, saw through all the larks and the frippery and considered how this invention might be applied to warfare. And it's worth breaking my timeline to have a look at the role that the balloon has played in military history. This is probably the only time we'll be looking at balloons in detail on the podcast, which is, after all, about airships, but the history of balloon warfare is definitely worthy of a detour, and not just because I'm also interested in military history. Join me next time, then, for a look at the role balloons have played in warfare. We'll also pick up the thread of airship history by examining the biggest problem of early flight: how to build an aircraft that could actually be steered. That's it for this episode, but please do stick around for a sneak preview of the next Patreon episode, an interview with Lynn Newton from the Anderson Abruzzo Balloon Museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And you can sign up for the Patreon at www.patreon.com/upshippod. Email the podcast with your thoughts, comments, and questions at upshippodcast@gmail.com. You can also find the podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at upshippod. I hope you enjoyed your flight with us today. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and review, and join me next time for more aerial adventures on Upship, the Airship History Podcast.
When I first started here, I actually started in 2020, and it was during the pandemic. I mean, who gets a job during the pandemic? I did. But part of it was there was a vacancy with this position, and guess what? It was the 50th anniversary for Balloon Fiesta coming up, and the museum wanted to do a new exhibit to highlight the event and, present it in a new way in the museum. And so I started and hit the ground running, doing research and learning all kinds of things. And we quickly got into, just the full throes of exhibit development. And so in 2021, during Balloon Fiesta, which Balloon Fiesta is a very special event that people, visitors can go right up to the balloons and talk to the pilots. And it's just a very, very cool environment. And it's just thousands of people over the course of 9 days, close to 1 million people come through. And it's extraordinary. And it's not common for, a lot of other balloon rallies don't allow visitors to do that kind of thing. So we were doing videoing, capturing, doing interviews with people on the field and pilots and running around. And it was just loads of fun. And we met this one young pilot who just stole the show, an incredible interview, and just so excited about what he was doing and so eager to share. And next thing I know, me and my film guy are up in the balloon with him. It was just kind of like, oh, great, and you want to go up? And so next thing, and during Balloon Fiesta, when there's upwards at any time, possibly 600 balloons in the air, you're just surrounded in this beautiful landscape. It's just incredible. But it's kind of a testament to this event and the organic nature of things, and really anything's kind of possible. I mean, it's also common for people who want a crew to then get a ride and things like that. So it's just that kind of environment, a really cool experience.